I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We have our speaker on Zoom, and Jim Patch is going to do the introduction of our economist, who's going to talk about the contradictory economy.
Good morning. Scott Beyer. Beyer is a professor at Clemson University, and that's in South Carolina, for those of you who don't know where it is. He is currently serving as the chair of the department of the John E. Walker Department of Economics. He holds a doctorate in economics from Michigan State University. And prior to joining the faculty at Clemson, Professor Beyer was an assistant professor at the University of Notre Dame, where he was awarded the Amico Outstanding Teacher Award. Professor Beyer's research interests include the causes and consequences of globalization, the economic impact of free trade agreements, and economic growth. From 2007 to 2008, he served as a senior economist on the President's Council of Economic Advisors under George W. Bush. From 1999 to 2012, Scott was a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta. He has also served as a consultant to the Congressional Budget Office, the United States International Trade Commission, USAID, and the baseball organization now called the Cleveland Guardians. And for those of you who don't know, that used to be the Cleveland Indians. Please welcome Professor Scott Beyer.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the nice introduction. So I have a lot of slides to go through, and I'm sure you will have a lot of questions as well. So I'm going to try to move through these as quickly as we can. My objective of this talk is to paint an economic story with figures, I think, that will be consistent with some of the things that you've read or heard about in the news or seen on TV, but also probably show you some things that you haven't read or seen. And I think, again, I'm going to weave together a nice economic story of what's going on. One, what has already transpired, and two, how that's impacting things down the road. So before I get too far, let me explain a little bit about NEED. NEED is the National Economic Education Delegation. There are 54 members, board members of NEED, including 2 former Fed chairs, 6 past members of the Council of Economic Advisors, 645 members. Really quickly, the purpose of NEED is to provide what I would say are the consensus view of what most academic and policy economists think that's going on within the economy and over a whole wide range of topics. So, you know, kind of one of the more popular ones is the slide deck I'm giving today on the state of the economy. But at the end, I'll list several other topics that NEED has presentations for. So if you have some upcoming event, birthday party, or something like that you need an economic talk for, we'll be happy to provide those as well. So this slide deck was co-authored by John Haveman, who is the founder of NEED, myself, Jeffrey Woglum, Brian Dombeck, and Doris Stevenson. So everyone has contributed to these. Those are the 5 people who have contributed to this slide deck. And again, remember that this is more or less presenting a consensus view of what most economists think. Of course, I'll slip in my own views on occasion, but I will make sure I will tell you when my views differ widely from kind of the consensus view. In most cases, they do not. So really, to get started, is the economic recovery and the contradictory evidence we're getting is all based on this large, what I would say in an economic term, is an exogenous shock or a health shock that's impacted the economy. Prior to the pandemic, which we could say began in March of 2020, the economy had some issues associated with them, but we were in the process, I think, of trying to deal with some of those in kind of longer term issues. But in terms of economic growth, inflation and unemployment, the economy was in a reasonable spot. And then we got hit with this pandemic. And really, in the end, the economic recovery won't really be fully. We won't be back to kind of a new normal, whatever that is, until the health side of this is addressed, and then we can go on with more or less our normal lives. So again, really the economic recovery depends on where we are in terms of number of new cases, new variants, rate of vaccinations, and overall immunity. And I don't think I can stress that enough. Let me provide some takeaways. It may get lost in the myriad of graphs I show today, but here are my takeaways, I think, for what you should know about economic growth coming up in the economy in 2022. The IMF expects the US to grow at about 5.2% this year. That's a little bit higher than most other organizations. But I think also importantly, the IMF is expecting a relatively robust recovery in the world. As you probably know or may be aware, the US has been a little bit out front in terms of the rest of the year, in terms of the economic recovery. While overall the growth is expected to be high, relatively high, 5.2% this year, economic growth in 2022, the first quarter, will be muted for some of the reasons I'll discuss below. So I wouldn't expect a really strong first quarter this year. We'll probably see, again, depending on the variants and addressing the health issues, we'll probably see a relatively strong second half of the year. The labor market still faces some challenges. While the unemployment rate is low, it's masked some of the underlying issues, again, some of the contradictory issues that's going on in the labor market. So in many sectors, we have not reached the pre-pandemic employment levels. I'll talk a little bit about what's going on there. We don't have all the answers, we probably have more questions at this point than answers. But again, I think I'll highlight what's going on and what we know to date. Again, it's really in some ways a little early to be able to disentangle all of the things that are driving some of the challenges that face the labor market. And then, of course, I'm going to end with inflation. I'm happy to address or talk about any other questions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is fueling inflation. I'm going to talk about supply chain disruptions, in some way how supply chain disruptions are maybe misinterpreted a little bit in the data or how it's portrayed on the news. And I'm also going to talk about how changes in the composition of demand are impacting inflation. Sorry about that. I had a phone call come in. I apologize. So again, one of the things that's going to slow down, as I mentioned, the Q1 economic growth is the Omicron variant that really hit the economy in late December and January. Anytime a new variant pops up, it slows down certain aspects of the economy, certain sectors of the economy, and you'll see exactly what sectors those are. But you can imagine that big spike in the number of cases that occurred in the first quarter of 2022 is going to slow down. The first month of 2022 is going to slow down economic growth a little bit. But if we continue our downward trajectory with the number of cases, again, the economic recovery should get back underway. But that's not the only thing I think that's going to be a drag on the first quarter GDP. I'll skip this for sake of time. Again, one of the go-to things that measures of economic performance that economists go to, of course, is gross domestic product, or the income that's produced by or the production that's produced by an economy over a period of time. Since it's produced by an economy over time, it must be income for some individuals. So we use GDP both as a measure of production and income. And one of the things I think is notable, and we shouldn't forget, even though we're worrying about the health issues and the recovery from the pandemic, there's some longer run issues at play here. So what I have graphed here is the long run kind of path of GDP along with the long run trend. If you go back to say the 1940s all the way up until the early 2000s, GDP grew at about 3% a year. And what you can see are there are periods of time where we go into a recession, where we dip below that long run trend, but we always get pulled back up. Similarly, there'll be some periods we're above the trend line, but we end up getting pulled back. The Great Recession was something different. We dipped below the long run trend line, and we've had slower economic growth since then. So again, one of the longer run issues we've been trying to deal with over the last decade is this slower economic growth, that if we could have been growing at this 3.1%, GDP would be 11% higher. You know, is that a big deal? Well, yeah, for just this year alone, that if we could be back at this trend level, each person would have an additional $5,000 of income. Coming from a family of 5 individuals, I know we certainly could have used an additional $25,000 this year. So again, when we think about this little bit slower economic growth, it ends up adding up over time. And I'm going to highlight in this slide really one of the things I think both the Trump administration and the Biden administration talk a little bit about what they've been trying to address. So you can see this is average growth rate by decades. Of course, you had very robust growth in the 50s, 60s. Things kind of slowed down with the oil shocks and other events in the 70s. 80s kind of had faster growth. And again, in the 90s with the internet boom, again, we saw even faster growth. If you look at the last 2 decades, the growth rate is notably less than what it's been in the prior 5 decades. And again, this matters quite a bit. If we could have that 4% growth economy, our incomes would double roughly every 18 years. But in an economy that grows at only 2%, it takes 36 years for income to double. So these small differences in growth rates are big effects, lead to big effects over time. And so the Trump administration, through cutting taxes and eliminating deregulation, that's what that administration thought was going to spur longer economic growth. And of course, the Biden administration has taken a different approach with Build Back Better, with the idea of investing in social infrastructure and physical infrastructure that will increase the productive capacity. Again, both presidents have tried to deal with these longer run issues of slower growth. They've just taken a different approach to doing that. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about not only the economic recovery of the pandemic, but kind of one of the longer run issues that's been occurring in the economy over time. And again, that shows basically the same thing, so I'll skip that slide. So the economic recovery, I think it's been really interesting, and I'm going to break the economic recovery into a couple components that are really driving it. Of course, we could break GDP up, if you remember from your macro class, or if you read about macroeconomics as a hobby or read with your friends, that GDP can be broken up into expenditures, that what consumers, you and I, buy, investment, the purchase of plants, machines, and equipment, and new housing, government spending, and net exports. What has been really the main driver of the economic recovery has been from the consumption side. Support for the economic recovery, the economy was in relatively good shape structurally before the pandemic. And once we started to come out of, say, the economic side of the pandemic, consumers came back relatively quickly. A lot of that response by consumers, I should say at least a fair amount of that response by consumers, was supported by the fiscal and monetary stimulus provided income and job support. Also, investment has been very supportive of GDP growth in the last 2 quarters of 2021. I don't anticipate investment, the purchase of plants, machines, and equipment, as being as supportive in the first half of 2022, and I'll make a quick argument why. So let's first look at consumption. Again, one thing is, if you look coming out of the Great Recession, here's where the Great Recession occurred. This is kind of the long run trend path of consumption. You could kind of see we dipped below, But even so, if we think about the new trend that emerged coming out of the Great Recession, the one thing that you see, and this is one thing about the pandemic that we often see, are these sudden drops. Again, no other economic recession or recovery had such sudden drops and quick bounce backs. But we had this sudden drop of consumption, but you notice we're right back up to where we were on trend. So again, this has been one of the fastest recoveries on the consumption side, a dramatic drop down, but we bounce back up. Well, what has been one of the causes of that? Well, again, we can look at the kind of the long run trends, and you can see it's not quite a straight line, but it has a couple wiggles to it. But what is notably different is this area out here that occurred during the pandemic. This is a look at personal disposable income and real personal disposable income. And one of the things that we see that happened here, and you could probably guess why we had big jumps or big increases in disposable income, these increases came from the different stimulus packages, whether they were the stimulus checks that got mailed out to households, whether it was the extended and increased unemployment benefits, or the additional child care payments. All of these provided additional disposable income that people had. And as you can imagine, if you have additional income, what are you likely to do with it? Well, in some ways, you're likely to spend. Some people use some of that additional income to buy down debt. Some of the people use that additional income to put into savings, but no doubt that those large increases in personal disposable income went to also help on the spending side by consumers. So again, this is the indication that the stimulus packages by the government were important in terms of the economic recovery from the consumption side. And again, here you can see that, my dashed lines for some reason here didn't translate as well. But again, what the blue line is intended to represent is disposable income. The red line is consumption. Again, you could see first you had this drop in consumption. Then the government was relatively quick to respond with stimulus packages, and this helped the economy recover. So this really combines the last two graphs, and there's a little bit of a distortion. I apologize. I don't know why those dashed lines didn't end up where they were supposed to. Another way that we could look at what happened on the spending side from consumers, and this is one of the things the economists had to switch into looking at, because normally our data comes in at best monthly, most often quarterly, but during the pandemic, we needed daily updates. And so luckily in this world of big data, we were able to switch to some additional data that we don't normally look at, but is collected by the private sector. And we could get a snapshot of what was happening each day in the economy. So this is national spending relative to how much people were spending at the beginning of 2020. Again, so again, think of these as a percent deviation. Once again, there you see that dramatic drop, that national spending fell about 30%. And I think everybody remembers that around that time in March, it was whether it was the local, probably was the Big Ten basketball tournament that was canceled. I know the ACC tournament was canceled on that day. The NBA canceled the game, and that night President Trump came on. I think everybody at that point on March 13th, March 14th, realized the world that we lived in was going to be quite different for some time period. And again, as soon as that happened, you saw a dramatic drop in consumer spending. But now, if you kind of look to where we were by the end of the year, you see again, consumers were spending quite a bit. Of course, you could look at different spending categories, and I wanted to highlight that the drop in spending was uneven, and you can imagine that the biggest drops in spending occurred in areas like food and accommodation, arts and entertainment, and healthcare. Why? Because those were the activities, those service activities where people interacted one-on-one or in large groups, and that's like most the places where the pandemic or COVID was most likely to spread. So individuals chose not to, or governments also assisted in helping individuals choose not to go out to eat, not to go to the movies, not to attend concerts. And again, one of the more surprising things is the drop in healthcare spending. But again, remember going back to that time period, you would think, oh, with a health crisis, healthcare spending would go up. But if you go back to that time period, we stopped doing lots of normal health spending in terms of going to the dentist, going to the eye doctor, some standard screenings that we would have done, the cancellation of routine procedures, or maybe even not some routine procedures. They caused a quite dramatic drop. So you can see, rather than a 30% drop in overall spending, things like arts and entertainment, you saw an 80% drop. Again, here's where we can highlight, again, the efficacy of what I'll say of the government stimulus packages. Here I break up spending into high income, low income, and middle income. Of course, high income people were the ones who had their spending drop by the most. Why is that? Of course, they had more discretionary spending. They took fewer vacations. They bought fewer luxury type goods. So they were the ones who were able to cut their spending back the most. Whereas lower income households, because they were probably buying a higher percentage of the goods were necessities, they didn't, they were unable to cut back by as much. So you can see, which is drawn by the purple line here, lower income spending didn't fall by as much as high income, and middle income fell by someplace in between. But I think what is interesting about this graph is you can see right here, this dashed line, which I'll show one more time. This is when the stimulus checks went out. And you can see in response to the stimulus checks going out, you can see a relatively big increase in consumers, both of middle income households and of high income households. And then each time those stimulus checks went out, you also saw big increases. So again, this is some indication that these new policies, whether the stimulus checks or increasing and extending the unemployment benefits, all of those things had a notable response by consumers, and you can see that in this daily spending graph. If you look at spending in Wisconsin, again, it looks very similar to national spending, almost no difference. That when these stimulus checks went out, there was typically a jump up in consumer spending. You didn't see it as much up here because it looks like by April of 2021, Wisconsin was spending about 20% more than what they were in January of 2020. So there may not have been as much room to go. So again, the takeaway here from this slide that I wanted is that, or these last couple slides, is you could see the increase in consumer spending each time the checks went out. Another thing I think that's going to be important for understanding what's coming down the road, and let me try to make sure I explain this graph. What I did is I normalized spending on goods and services to 100. So the blue line here is spending on goods. The red line here is spending on services. So you think any movement from 100, think of that as a percent deviation. So what happened coming out of the pandemic? Well, again, going into the pandemic, or I should say during the economic recovery, we had both a relatively big drop in consumer spending on goods and services, but then within just a matter of time, household spending tilted to buying more goods and less services. Again, think about intuitively, what were most households doing? Since you were going to be at home, spending more time at home, you're more likely to buy a big screen TV, buy a new computer, buy things, durable goods that would make life at home more comfortable. To the point, at one point, we were spending 33% more on durable goods than what we were spending pre-pandemic. And when we look at spending on services, we're not even back up to the level that we were at pre-pandemic. So again, one of the more notable things, and I'm going to come back to how that's impacting things today, is not only has consumer spending got back up to where it was before, there's been a pretty big rotation or shift in terms of the type of things that consumers are buying. They're still buying more goods and fewer services. Perhaps those things normalize this year, but as this date ended, we're still spending 15% more on goods than what we were pre-pandemic. So again, the takeaways on the consumption side, consumption has rebounded rapidly coming out of the recession. The rebound in consumption was supported by the stimulus packages that were passed by the Trump and Biden administration. Compared to before the pandemic, consumption has shifted more toward the consumption of goods and still a little bit away from services. This demand side effect, right, is causing some of the supply chain disruptions that we're hearing about. I think there's a general tendency when you hear supply chain disruptions, it's all on the supply side. A part of that is true, but also a big part of that is due to this big increase in demand for goods. When you have a bunch of people calling their local suppliers saying, I need more of this good delivered, at some point, the supplier is going to say, I can't get you that item. And then the person's going to hang up and blame it on supply side, when really it's a demand side effect, this big increase in demand that makes it look like it's a supply side. Now, I'll provide a little bit more evidence on this as we go through the talk. On the investment side, remember, this is the purchase of the plants, machines, and equipment. Investment has been supportive of economic growth the last few quarters. But I think the uncertainty is still surrounding about what the new normal is going to look like and what sectors are going to thrive is causing some businesses to slow down their level of investment, or I should state differently, not want to increase their capacity until they get more clarity on the direction of the pandemic and the economy. And if we look at what we can see here, that investment has been positively contributing to economic growth. But the main thing that's been driving investment is the changes in business inventory. That is, they're accumulating more stuff, either more intermediate raw goods or processed goods that haven't sold yet. And that change in business inventory was one of the main drivers of GDP growth last period. And what I want to emphasize here is that notice that these changes in business inventory, if I look historically back over time, they'll be high for 1 quarter or 2 quarters, but then they end up, those inventories start getting bid back down and they start taking off for growth. So this is another reason why I think in Q1 of 2022 is that we'll get slower growth, because it will probably revert back to lower levels of inventory, which will knock away or chip away at GDP growth. It may not be an indication that the economy is doing worse, but it's just kind of a natural reorientation of inventories. So let's now switch over to talking about employment. Of course, production and employment are going to be related. I'm going to start out quickly going through unemployment growth, employment growth, and employment by sector. So as we know, that you probably have read and seen in the news that the unemployment rate is about back to where we were pre-pandemic. It went down to 3.9% and then ticked back up to 4%. Pre-pandemic, we were at 3.5%. We had this big spike and have worked our way down. Well, we often report and use the unemployment rate as a measure of the health on the employment side. There are some things that are masked in there. So economists more recently have been looking at employment changes rather than unemployment. So this is also reported on the same day that the unemployment rate is reported, is this measure of changes in non-farm inventory. And now notice here, I present data from 1990 to 2019. So you get an idea of what an average month looks like. So what's on this axis are numbers in thousands. So you can think in a good month, we're averaging about 200,000 jobs created. In really good months, it's about 300 to 350,000 jobs. During the Great Recession, you could see as bad as it got, a bad month was we lost 800,000 jobs. So in a normal month, we add about 131,000 jobs during normal times, good times. Now, again, what I'm going to do in the next slide, I'm going to add in the next 2 years. And what you'll see is how this pandemic just almost completely distorts all of the data series that we would have looked at before. So here's when I add the last 2 years. So you can see all of these big, seemingly high peaks and valleys or low valleys now become almost trivial compared to what happened in March and April of 2020. We lost nearly 22 million jobs in a matter of 2 months. Again, we've never seen anything like that. And again, now here's back to the Great Recession, and look how small that looks. And you can see since that period of time, we've been working our way back, and we haven't gotten all the way back. Okay, so here's a chart that shows kind of the recovery that we've experienced since May of 2020. We gained about 2.6 million jobs in May of 2020. In June, we gained 4.5 million jobs. And you can see, with the exception of December 2020, we've been adding roughly 250 to 500,000 jobs each month. So again, kind of highlighting the changes in employment that we've seen. In March and April of 2020, the US economy lost nearly 22 million jobs. Since that time, the economy has recovered about 19 million jobs. We're still roughly 3 million jobs below where we were in 2020. And if you consider adding in that we would normally add 131,000 jobs per month, that means we're roughly 6.5 million jobs below where we should be. So again, that number is striking, both the 3 million and the 6.5 million. Even though we've been adding 400 to 500,000 jobs each month, we still have a way to go to get us back to where we were pre-pandemic, and a longer way to go to where we were that would put us back on trend. If you look at the job losses, so these red numbers represent job losses, of course, what industries did they occur in? Well, it's not a surprise in those industries that had the biggest drop in consumers going to them. Leisure and hospitality, education and health services, retail trade. You saw that we lost 8 million jobs in leisure and hospitality, almost 3 in education and health services, and 2.25 in retail trade. So those alone account for roughly 13 million jobs that we lost. When we look at the recovery, we can see certain areas, certain industries have done better. Retail trade now is above pre-pandemic levels. So the blue line represents all the gains we've had from May 2020 up until January, of 2022. Construction, we're almost back to where we were. Transportation and warehouses, we're back to where we were. But you can still see we have almost a long way to go in terms of leisure and hospitality, still about 1.8 million jobs below where we were. Health and education, about 700,000. And then business services, we're up about 500,000 jobs. So you can see there's a fair amount of heterogeneity in the recovery. And again, it's all interrelated to the pandemic and what sectors were the hardest hits and what sectors continue to be impacted by the pandemic. I'll skip this. Here's what's looking, again, more what's going on the labor market side. And you probably have read a fair amount of this. There are two ways there's a very crude way. There are two ways people lose their jobs. They either quit or they're laid off. So the red line represent layoffs. You can see there's a big jump in layoffs at the beginning of the pandemic. But the one thing that we see is the blue line. That's the line that's interesting. If there's one thing economists like when it comes to the labor markets, it's quitters. Why? Because quitters are indicative of a relatively healthy labor market, in the sense of I'm only willing to quit my job if I have a better job offer or if I have better job prospects. And you can see pre-pandemic, the quit rate was going up, but it has really shot up again coming out of the pandemic. And this is often referred to as the Great Resignation, where we have all these people leaving their jobs. And you can see in a pecuniary sense, in terms of wage growth, there's been a big increase for those people who are willing to switch jobs. That's the red line. By switching jobs, they're getting about a 5.4% increase in pay. And the people who stay in their jobs are only getting a 3.5%. Again, one thing that you should see here is, while it's always higher, you can always imagine I'm most likely only going to switch jobs if I get higher pay. We haven't seen such a big pull away that we've seen here. So again, there are reasons why people are leaving their jobs for other jobs. Again, this is another graph I didn't label, but I'm running short on time. So I will rather have this be the audience participation point. I'll go ahead and tell you what the difference here is the black line here represents job openings and the green line represents job hires. So we have never seen a gap like this where we have roughly 3 million jobs opening that are bigger than job hires. So again, this is what we see when we drive around town. We see the help wanted, willing to pay $1,000 bonus, management positions available. This is again part of the Great Resignation, part of the demand. What was referred to the last time I gave this talk is the war for talent. All of these businesses are trying to find and hire the best and brightest, and it's a very competitive market out there. Going quickly through this slide, you know, when we talk about the Great Resignation, where are people resigning from? So these are pre-COVID quit rates by industry, and you can imagine accommodation and food services. Anyone who held jobs at a bar or a restaurant knows what the quit rates are like, and those have the highest quit rates. Retail trade has a lot of job turnover. If you add in, now if I show what's happening during the Great Resignation or coming out of the pandemic, you can see these quit rates are up across the board. So in accommodation and food services, they're about 7% per month, relative to 4.8% per month. And even in manufacturing, where we expect the quit rate to be relatively low, they're at quite elevated levels. So one of the things that we're seeing here, again, is during this Great Resignation, is people are leaving their jobs, looking for something else different. And one of the things that is impacting, I think, the labor market currently, remember, there's been a relatively big shift in terms of goods production. Where are people leaving their jobs primarily is from the service industry. So there may be some mismatch between the type of jobs in demand and the skill sets of the individuals who are leaving one job going into another. So again, there could be some structural issues in the labor market. And I'll skip this for the sake of time. So let me quickly go over the employment situation. I'll spend a few minutes talking about inflation. Employment is still on the rebound. The real challenge for employers has been to fill vacancies. What gives? Some have argued that the extended unemployment benefits or additional government stimulus have provided disincentives for individuals to work. If those things were still present now, since those things have expired, those factors shouldn't be stopping individuals from coming back. Another reason is that parents with young children are still have their young children at home, so it's difficult for them to have the flexibility to take jobs when they have to do childcare. Some workers are reluctant to work in certain industries. I know people who won't go back into the restaurant industry or back into other industries where individuals gather in large crowds. Workers are also looking for different career opportunities. We hear this quite a bit. And also it's the case that workers are looking for better opportunities even within the industry or occupation they were working for. So again, I was reading the results from a recent survey, and you see employees are looking for non-pecuniary benefits. They have increased desire to have options to work at home. They want better working conditions in general, and they want better recognition for their accomplishments. So I think the workers are being a little bit more selective about the work environment they're going into. So let me wrap things up discussing inflation. Inflation now is at 7.5%, as is again widely discussed on the news. That's the highest it's been since the early 80s. Again, the big difference between what's now and the early 80s is we were happy, I think, back then that inflation was only 7.5% since it was coming down from a high of 14.6. So we had some belief that in the future inflation was going to come back down. There's there is a fair amount of uncertainty surrounding now where inflation is going to be for the rest of the year. I think we've heard a lot, most people drop the term transitory. The question is inflation going to continue to rise in 2022, or is it going to moderate? So what's driving inflation? There have been several arguments about what's driving inflation. One has been profiteering or greed. You've heard President Biden and Senator Warren discuss this. Supply chain disruptions, I think, are a contributing factor. The pandemic has impacted the ability to get parts and supplies. Also, the labor shortages are pushing up wages, and that have raised the cost and helped push up production. Also, the cost of transport with higher petroleum and gas prices are having cost effects that are driving prices as well. Then lastly, I'm going to also argue that there's been an increase in demand, that during the pandemic, there's been an increase in the demand for goods over services. And for many of these goods, it's not easy to simply ramp up production. So when demand goes up by quite a bit and you can't respond on the quantity side, that means prices have to go up. And then also spurring on this demand, and again, is this the fiscal and monetary authorities have provided lots of stimulus. So I'm going to spend, I think, 2 minutes, and then I will end there abruptly, kind of discussing each of these. If you look at profit margins, and this is after-tax profits, yes, profit margins have gone up dramatically this year. But there have been other periods in which profit margins have risen dramatically, and we don't see inflation accompanying profit margins. In fact, if you look over time, there's no real historical correlation between profit margins and inflation. Again, do I think it should, in a broader context, should the Biden administration follow a robust antitrust policy? Of course so, but I don't think an antitrust policy will have much effect on overall inflation. In fact, if you look at after tax and before tax profits, you can see before tax profits aren't high historically. One of the reasons our after tax profits have risen so dramatically in, say, the last 5 or 6, 10 years is because of how we treat now profits. They get a more favorable treatment. So you can see there was a bigger gap between before and after tax profits. Now there's a smaller gap. So again, profits have risen up because of the favorable tax treatment. On the supply side, again, this is where I'm arguing it's partly driven by demand, just not supply side factors. These are containerized imports in 2021 compared to 2018 and 2019. So you could see imports coming into the economy are higher than what they were pre-pandemic. Again, that's a demand side effect, and that demand side effect is often getting reported as a supply side factor, but it really is the increase in demand for goods has made it difficult for all demanders to buy these goods, and it's made it difficult for the distribution of goods, putting upward pressure on prices. So skip that, that's just delivery days. Then the last thing I'm going to focus on is the increase kind of in demand. If you look at money growth, and this is M2, is kind of M2 is a broad form of money that reflects demand accounts, savings accounts, how much you and I choose to hold in money. The Federal Reserve has less control over this. If you look at the growth of M2 from 2000 up until the pandemic, it grew at about 6% a year. And again, you can see that the Fed has very little control, less control over M2. Because here is the pandemic, and you can see it barely made a wiggle. So while the Fed was doing a lot with the money supply in 2007, 2008, 2009, it had very little impact on broader money. But then when you look out what's happened in the last year, you saw a dramatic increase in a couple months and then a faster growth rate. Well, what caused that? Well, that's precisely a couple things were going on here. One, unlike things in the past, what happened here was the money was what Milton Friedman referred to as like a helicopter drop. Rather than me deciding to hold more money, I woke up one morning and I had a check deposited from the Treasury in my bank account, whether that was unemployment benefits, a stimulus check, or whatever. We woke up one morning holding more cash than what we had. And again, when we have more cash than what we would like to hold in our accounts, we have a tendency to rebalance that portfolio. Some of it we may, as I mentioned before, we may pay off some debts. We may buy different assets, but most likely what a fair amount of people did was they spent. So we had a dramatic increase in the money growth that occurred in April and June of 2020, and an annual rate, the money growth grew at 46%. And then over the last year and a half, the money growth has grown about 13.1%. Primarily, there are two reasons why it's grown. Again, primarily because of the injection of money that came through the different stimulus packages and by the Fed. Also, what was a little bit different, unlike the Great Recession, was the banking sector was in pretty good shape. And so the banks had no problem lending funds out. So there have been more loans going on rather than going back to the Great Recession where banks weren't lending things out. That also got more money in circulation. So again, going back to the earlier pictures, when people had more money, they started to spend more. So it increased their disposable income, it increased their spending. Again, in how their spending changed was important. They were buying more durable goods than services, or more goods than services. Increase in demand for goods. Again, if you can't, one of the issues is if you can't respond quickly to that increase in demand, you can't respond on the quantity side, it's going to lead to higher prices. And again, here is where you can see where some of the inflation is coming from. Here is the inflation rate on goods versus the inflation rate on services, and you can see it shot up to 8.8%. And what's shocking about this is if you look back over the last 10 years or so, inflation on goods has been close to zero. Why? Because we've had productivity growth in terms of producing goods, and international trade have all helped keep prices down. This big shock increase in demand for goods has led to a dramatic increase in the overall price of goods, again, consistent with the story I've told. But I should also state that we're also now seeing a rise in inflation on services. It had been buzzing along at about 2%. Now it's up to 4%. So I'll end with a couple pieces of good news here. You can look at how different income groups have been impacted by the higher inflation. While we think a higher inflation erodes our purchasing power, it's individuals on the lowest income quartile have benefited the most, because they are the ones who have been most in demand for jobs. And so they're getting higher wages, whether it's $1,000 bonus or a $18 an hour wage. Their wages have risen more than inflation. So their real wage has gone up. They're not doing as well as they were doing in 2018 and 2020, but over the last 2 years, they have done better. And if you look at the highest quartile, we always think that they're the ones who get the favorable treatment, but you can see that the highest quartile is their wages haven't been rising as fast as inflation. So again, to end kind of with a quick conclusion, that over the next year or the first quarter, GDP growth will be slower, but I think in the second half of the year, GDP growth will pick up. The increase in demand for workers and occupations and industries is boosting the wages for low income households. I think that's an important takeaway. I expect that to continue. Will a renormalization of the labor market occur? Where will be the growing jobs? Again, I think it depends on how the pandemic is addressed and what sectors begin to grow and what sectors come back. And then the second thing is, what will be the will there be an additional stimulus in terms of an infrastructure package that could push up GDP growth? It also could push up inflation depending on how it's spent. And I will stop now because I know I've gone over time, so I apologize for going over. I hope I was able to spin a story of what's going on and what's coming down the road. And I thank you once again for inviting me to, at least virtually, to Wisconsin today.
Thank you, Scott. And I'm going to have to say, we do not have time for questions. Sorry, you did run a little bit long, Scott, but thank you very much for your insights. And I think I have a little clearer picture of what's been happening. So that's always good. Thank you.
Thank you. If you have any questions, you can always send them to me. I'll put my email in the chat. I'm happy to answer.
And Jim said you were very responsive. So if you do have some specific questions, we can share the email. So thank you again, Scott.
Guys, for not leaving any time for questions. Thank you again.
Business. We first have Mr. Icky with our moment of reflection. And happy President's Day. I forgot to say that earlier. No mail today.
Happy President's Day, Mr. President.
Again, Peter Fisher comes to my rescue. How's that, you say? He's in Hawaii right now. That's true, and I'm taking care of his house, taking in the mail, watering plants, checking on frozen pipes, and so forth. On one of my inspection trips, I went into his living room and saw a little book of poetry sitting on his coffee table. So in celebration of President's Day, Black History Month, the full moon, and Peter, I will read from this book, not in its entirety, but a truncated matter for flavor only. It's by Amanda Gorman. When day comes and we ask ourselves, where can we find light? In this never-ending shade, the loss we carry, a sea we must wade, we braved the belly of the beast, we learned that quiet isn't always peace. And from the norms and notions of what just is, isn't always justice. To compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and condition of man, we lay down our arms so that we can reach out our arms to one another. We seek harm to none, harmony for all. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true. Even as we grieved, we grew. Even as we hurt, we hoped. That even as we that even as we tired, we tried. That will forever be tied together victorious, not because we'll never again know defeat, but because we will never again sow division. If we live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in the bridges we've made. That is the promised glade, the hill we climb if only we dare it. Being in America is more than the pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. In this truth, in this faith, we trust. For while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us.
Thank you, John. The board, who's here, is meeting at 1 o'clock. So if you're interested, please come. A couple of the topics we're going to start discussing, I mentioned last week, which is staying here, or do we want to look for another site? We need feedback on that. So please share your thoughts and ideas. Since you're the main bulk of those who attend, I'll put more weight on your opinions. Sorry, but if you make it, let me know if you're interested in continuing, because we need to talk. And I talked to Jim. He's perfectly willing to keep us as clients. He's enjoying our stay here. So that's one topic. We'll do a little bit on budgets. We'll do just general discussions of board stuff. Announcements. Any announcements? Eileen. Yep.
First of all, on March 7th is the FFA Day, where we will be having the recipients, the 11 recipients of the awards. Both John Esser and I will be away that day, and John and I have always been the ones responsible for taking pictures. So we need a volunteer, and you don't have to use it. You can use your camera, your phone. So if you are one of those that takes pictures with your phone, you are perfectly capable of taking pictures that day. So please volunteer. The second one is in relation to the Madison Reading Project that has been brought up. We had Rowan Child as a speaker. How many of you have heard of the 100 Men of Dane County? Are anybody a member? Okay, the 100 Men of Dane County are a group of 100 men, or probably there's women in it, that each quarter donates $1,000. And then each quarter, they choose a recipient for that $100,000. Means they give away $100,000 every quarter. This past quarter, their recipient was the Madison Reading Project. And they got a grant of $91,000 to further their Books for Educators program. I doubt if this group would have gone for 91,000. However, it takes that out of playing field for us. I am meeting with Rowan on Wednesday morning before I get on a plane. She has some ideas that she would like to put forth for this club, and I will bring them forth. But just to let you know, there are people out there giving away money.
Thank you, Eileen. So we'll hear your discussion when you get back. Correct?
Yep.
Okay. I signed up for the Miracle League. The volunteer request went out over the weekend, I think, or maybe Friday of last week. Did you get it, Richard?
No.
No. Oh, I'm special. They are signing up volunteers for the Miracle League.
Yes, and I'm putting that link in the newsletter that should go out this afternoon.
Perfect. So if you want to physically volunteer, that will be your opportunity. And it is the same form basically as players or their families sign up. So you have to have an account. So you need a username and a password type of thing, but it's not too onerous. It's a way for them to really help organize the volunteering that's going on for the Miracle League.
And if you don't want to volunteer for one of those on the field things, they just make a note of it, because they're always looking for somebody to help with a different thing.
Yeah, it's wide open. Think of a baseball game with lots of kids, that activity. There's a lot of needs for volunteers. So the other thing with the Miracle League is I saw an announcement that they have sufficient funds to start putting in lights. So they will do that this spring. Anybody else see that? I don't remember even where I saw that. But they have well over $100,000 in hand to put in lights, thanks to a very generous donor, is what I recall reading. So there may be, and I think this was in the volunteer sign up, 3 games per night. I don't know if I want to umpire 3 straight games, but we'll see. We'll see how they come up with volunteers. Just a schedule note, next week is the Alzheimer's and Dementia Alliance in Wisconsin. It is a retired associate dean from the School of Ed who may or may not come in person, who's going to give the program on Alzheimer's. He is an administrator for that nonprofit, I assume. So Jeff Hand will be here. And also, Abe asked for the foundation to give a report, right?
Yes.
And we will have that right after Jeff is done with his program, 10 to 15 minutes on the foundation and its status, et cetera. Oh, that's another thing we're going to talk about at the board meeting is matching opportunities for member donations. As Abe said last week, it's up to the membership to decide if we want to identify some specific programs where the foundation will match individual grants. So if you have an opinion on that, come to the board meeting. As Eileen said, March 7th is the FFA Awards. Then we have Food Pantry. We have on the 21st, I finally found or was told who's on the docket for the 21st. It's going to be about police and mental health, how they deal with some of the stressful situations and climate that they're now in as a police officer. And then lastly, we still hope UW Athletics and Chris McIntosh will be able to come here. I was at the basketball game yesterday and it was quite an interesting ending to the game. And right thereafter, I didn't cause it, but I observed it. And I think that is it, unless there's any other announcements. We are good to go. Don't go driving around in the morning. It sounds like we're gonna have a nice ice storm, so be careful if you have to go anywhere. We are out of here, except for the board. We'll be over there. Let's take that empty one.
I'll take any help I can get.
Annie served
Oh, I can't remember.
You're gonna leave us? He'll take pictures.
Okay.
He wants to know who to send them to. Go home.
Yeah.
Hi. I just want to say no. Oh, be careful. I fell down. I was gonna see.
I will.
Yes. There's just too many things being done. I don't. It's not the same.
So we got out cornered, eh?
When our advantage.
On the meeting. That's fine.
You have a chance to take a tour of greenhouses, big greenhouses in Iowa.
It also indicates there's a lot more generous people than our club is.
Yeah, we don't quite have that.
It's my sarcasm. Send the pictures to me.
Where did I?
Who?
Me. After that Monday.
Yeah, and then, so it'd be a big student that gets a certificate.
Yeah, Dick will be here. And he usually takes a picture of the students and their advisor without the name. So they can use it for something. And then he takes it with the name so we know who they are.
Then when you meet with this reading gal, ask if there's a need for more libraries.